The sky above the training valley had a washed-out metallic blue tint that never looked quite natural to Mark, no matter how many weeks he spent on this planet. Two suns hung lopsided over the ridgeline, one pale, one amber, and their combined light turned every shadow into something thin and double-edged. The air smelled faintly of iron and resin from the needle trees that ringed the clearing, and under that was the familiar aroma of nervous cadets, trace pheromones, heated scales, tang of alien sweat, and the faint ozone hint from a species that used microstatic discharges to regulate temperature. Mark shifted his pack on his shoulder and took his place at the end of the line, boots sinking slightly into the springy purple moss that served as grass here. All around him, the mixed-blooded crowd of students fidgeted, whispered in a dozen languages, and stole sidelong glances at the human who never quite acted like an exchange student should. The instructor arrived without fanfare, as usual. She was tall even by academy standards, with 4 narrow eyes stacked vertically and a thin mouth that could flatten into a terrifying line when she was displeased. Her uniform was the same dull gray as the rocky outcroppings, and the only color on her was the strip of rank pins that caught the sunslight in tiny, sharp flashes. She walked in front of the formation slowly, hands clasped behind her back, boots making a rhythmic crunch on the gravel path. Conversation died away as she passed, each cadet straightening just a little, some with military precision, some with awkward, late adjustments. Mark stood at something close to attention, shoulders back, expression neutral, breathing slow and deliberate. He had learned early that if he pretended he was back in basic, he would automatically fall into habits that impressed these instructors. The academy might call itself a multi-species exploratory leadership program, but a drill instructor was a drill instructor in any language. "Today," the instructor said, her voice amplified by the small collar unit at her throat, "you will demonstrate basic environmental adaptation under low support conditions." The collar translated simultaneously. For some cadets, the sounds emerged as musical chimes, for others as clicks overlaid with low hums. For Mark, it was standard with only a slight mechanical flatness. "You have been supplied," she continued, "with a standard field kit. You have been briefed on the weather patterns and fauna of this training valley. You have had 2 weeks of prior instruction on shelter theory. It is time to see if any of you listened." A ripple of unease moved through the line. Mark did not feel uneasy. His mind had already begun to tick through variables. Daylight left before the colder of the suns dipped, wind direction judged by the way the needles leaned, smell of distant moisture that could mean an evening fog. He looked past the instructor to the tree line and mentally mapped out the terrain he had seen on the shuttle's descent. Ravines to the west, a creek somewhere north by the way, the air grew slightly cooler in that direction, higher ground to the east where exposed stone caught the light. The instructor stopped directly in front of Mark's section and turned to face the group. "Your assignment is simple," she said. "Build a shelter. It must protect you from wind and rain. It must be stable enough to last 1 full cycle. It must be built using only materials you can find in this valley and the tools in your kit." She let that sink in. "We will evaluate based on efficiency, stability, and environmental impact. This is not a construction contest. It is a survival exercise. Minimalism is encouraged." Mark almost smiled at that word. Minimalism, in his experience, meant different things to different species. For some of his classmates, shelter meant an energy shield dome that hummed quietly and filtered air. For others, it meant a heat cocoon woven from reactive fibers that stiffened in wind. For Mark, the word had always conjured images of tents sagging in the rain, tarps tied between trees, or rough lean-tos made of branches and plastic sheets. Compared to some of the field work he had done, this already sounded generous. The instructor tapped the band on her wrist, and a series of floating icons appeared above the moss in front of the cadets, each labeled with a team number. "You have 3 hours to select a site and begin construction," she said. "You will work in pairs or trios, as previously assigned. She paused, scanning the formation. Her second set of eyes narrowed while the upper pair remained half-lidded in what Mark had learned was her version of a frown. All except one. For a heartbeat, the clearing was utterly silent. Then Mark felt several gazes shift toward him, followed by the faintest rustle of whispered names that never seemed to pronounce Mark quite right. The instructor lifted one hand and pointed directly at him. "Human Cadet Mark Rains will work alone," she said. "He has previously indicated prior survival training. This exercise will assess his individual adaptation." Mark's stomach did a small, reflexive twist, the old pre-mission flutter he never fully lost, no matter how much training he endured. He did not protest. The possibility of arguing crossed his mind for a fraction of a second, but he dismissed it. The Academy seemed fascinated by testing the edges of human endurance, and he had learned that objecting usually meant the test became worse, not better. He shifted his weight, nodded once, and said, "Understood, Instructor." The translation caller gave his words a moment later in a dozen synthetic voices. The instructor focused all four eyes on him for a beat too long. He had the uncanny sense that she was measuring him as an anomaly rather than a student, a data point in a study no one had officially mentioned. Then she broke eye contact and addressed the group again. "You will not share resources between teams unless authorized," she said. "You will not interfere with another team's construction attempts. You will log each major design decision in your field recorder. Remember, we are evaluating your reasoning as much as your result." She swept an arm toward the valley. "You may begin." The tension broke as cadets scattered in loose clusters, some immediately arguing over the best site, others fumbling with their kits to check what tools they still had. A pair of lanky, fur-fringed students trotted toward a shallow dip where the moss grew thicker, chattering about windbreaks. Another trio made straight for the creek line, drawn by the gleam of water through reeds. A group of scale-plated cadets with reflective eyes headed for the rocks, muttering about thermal mass and radiant heat retention. Mark remained where he was for a moment longer, letting the confusion swirl around him. His field kit was already open in his mind. One folding knife with a serrated edge, a compact multi-tool, 10 meters of synthetic cord rated for more weight than it would ever encounter, a thermal blanket, a coil of light-duty wire, a collapsible shovel-axe hybrid, and a handful of emergency fasteners that bit into almost any surface. Not much if he was planning anything ambitious, more than enough if he settled for the sort of lean-to the instructor probably expected. He knelt, unhooked the kit from his belt, and opened it anyway, checking each item with practiced fingers. Doing the inventory with his hands helped him think. Knife, cord, blanket, wire, shovel, fasteners. Nothing unexpected, nothing missing. He closed the kit with a click and looked up at the tree line again. A simple shelter. That was the phrase the instructor had used. The sensible response would be to pick a small rise near the tree line, orient a slanted roof away from the prevailing wind, tie a frame from branches, stretch the thermal blanket and moss over it, maybe dig a shallow drainage channel around the base in case of rain. He could do that in less than an hour and spend the remaining time refining details, adding small touches. He pictured it easily. Low roof, enough space for one person to lie down, a windbreak for the worst gusts. Functional, adequate, boring. Mark exhaled slowly and realized that the small twist in his stomach did not feel like dread anymore. It felt like anticipation. No one here had ever seen what human settlers did when they had trees, stones, and a day to spare. The Academy had read the reports, of course. The instructors had access to recorded footage of homesteading outposts where humans dropped with minimal supplies and still managed to raise something solid from the wilderness in a matter of days. But reports were abstract. Videos were flat. A thing you could walk into, lean against, smell the resin and smoke inside, that was different. He thought about the phrase, environmental adaptation, and found himself smiling faintly. There were many ways to adapt. One option was to bend yourself toward the environment until you barely occupied any space. Another option was to bend the environment just enough that it became comfortable. He slung the kit back onto his belt and finally started walking toward the forest, steps unhurried but purposeful. As he moved past the nearest clusters of cadets, conversations dipped and paused. A scaled cadet with a bluish crest leaned toward a friend and whispered something that made both of them glance at Mark's compact frame, as if trying to reconcile his unremarkable height and build with the stories that had already begun to circulate. Mark pretended not to notice, eyes on the tree trunks ahead. The trees here grew straight and tall, with bark that peeled away in long, fibrous strips, and wood that felt surprisingly dense when he had tested it on previous hikes. Good for load-bearing walls, he thought. If he notched the ends correctly, he could interlock them without needing more than a few fasteners. The moss underfoot would make decent insulation if packed into gaps, and the stones scattered around the creek could serve as a foundation or as part of something more interesting. His mind was already sketching shapes that went beyond a mere lean-to. Thicker walls, a real roof instead of a sheet, perhaps even an interior platform to get him off the chilly ground. The idea of a raised sleeping space tugged at his memory. He remembered nights back on Earth, cramped in a half-rotten cabin his grandfather had insisted on restoring by hand. That building had nothing to do with military efficiency or academy metrics. It had been an exercise in stubborn pride and practical nostalgia. His grandfather had taught him how to sight down a beam, how to listen to wood under strain, how to feel whether a log would settle straight or twist as it dried. At the time, Mark had grumbled and rolled his eyes, a teenager convinced that nothing built with hand tools in a damp forest could matter in a galaxy of drones and nanofabs. Yet here he was, on a distant world under twin suns, about to put those lessons to use in front of an audience of aliens who believed simple shelter meant something completely different. The forest accepted him with a change in light and sound, the chatter of cadets fading into the background as needles swallowed the echoes. The ground grew uneven, roots pushing up through the moss in sinuous ridges. Mark adjusted his stride without thinking, weaving between trunks as he searched for the right place. He needed relatively flat ground, decent drainage, access to straight trees he could fell without risk of crushing his own structure, and, ideally, a nearby source of stone. The wind blew from the west, carrying a hint of moisture. That meant storms, if they came, would likely push from that direction, too. He turned slightly eastward, using the trunks as a windbreak in his mind, mentally aligning possible floor plans with compass points. The field recorder at his belt pinged softly, reminding him to log his thought process. He tapped the control and spoke in a level voice. Cadet Mark Rains, shelter exercise. Moving into tree line seeking elevated but accessible site. Priorities: wind protection, drainage, structural material availability. Intend to construct a shelter with rigid walls rather than flexible membrane due to local resources. We'll begin by scouting for suitable foundation. The device chirped acknowledgement. Somewhere back in the control center, the instructor would be able to listen to his log in real time if she wished. Mark did not mind. If she wanted to understand how a human approached simple, she deserved the full picture. He pressed deeper into the trees until he spotted a slight rise in the terrain where the moss thinned and gray stone peeked through. A cluster of medium-thick trunks surrounded it, all close enough to harvest without hauling logs over ridiculous distances. Beyond the rise, the ground sloped gently down, and he heard the faint trickle of water. Perfect. Close enough to the creek for convenience, far enough that a sudden swell would not lap at his doorstep. He walked up onto the rise and turned in a slow circle, taking in sight lines. Through gaps in the trees, he could still see flashes of cadet movement in the clearing. From this vantage point, any instructor patrol would be able to find his shelter without trouble, which would matter for evaluation. Yet the site felt just far enough to make his work a little private, a small pocket of forest that could belong to him for an afternoon. Mark rolled his shoulders once, the habitual pre-task loosening he always did before a long job, and dropped his kit to the ground. The assignment was clear. The parameters were simple. The instructor had said, "Build a simple shelter." He knelt, dug his fingers into the moss to feel the firmness of the earth beneath, and, as the twin suns shifted overhead, began to form a decision that would turn a survival drill into something far more solid. Mark stood on the small rise, the forest light filtering through the tall needle trees and falling in thin, shifting strips across the ground as he prepared for what he knew would be the most physically demanding stretch of the task. The instructor had said nothing about prohibiting the use of natural materials on a larger scale, and Mark had no intention of stopping at branches and loose debris. If he wanted a structure that would hold, he needed logs, straight ones, thick enough to interlock properly, light enough that he could maneuver them alone, but strong enough to resist the valley's unpredictable winds. He glanced around, assessing the nearest trees, taking note of their lean, their bark texture, the spacing of their branches. The wood here felt different from what he remembered from Earth, denser somehow, humming faintly when tapped, as if storing energy within thin fibers. He ran his palm along a trunk and felt its cool, even pulse. He wondered briefly how quickly it dried, how well it split, and whether it splintered cleanly or sheared at odd angles. Those were questions he would answer soon enough. Before cutting anything, Mark walked the area slowly, marking in his mind what he would use and what he would leave untouched. He knew better than to over-harvest, especially here, where the instructor would undoubtedly scrutinize the impact on the environment. The rise offered a generous ring of mid-sized trees with clean vertical growth. A few had slight curves, which made them unsuitable for primary walls, but perfect for roof braces or secondary beams. If he chose correctly, he could fell 3 or 4, strip them clean, and begin constructing the basic skeleton of his cabin within an hour or two. He crouched near the base of the first tree, testing the soil. It felt firm beneath the thin moss layer, neither too loose nor too rocky, ideal for anchoring posts. The wind shifted, brushing his hair against his forehead, reminding him that daylight would not last forever. He needed to work quickly but carefully. He unsheathed his folding knife and tested its edge with his thumb, then reached into the kit for the compact multi-tool. The serrated saw on the multi-tool was small and crude compared to a proper blade, but he knew how to make each stroke count. He looped the synthetic cord around the first trunk as a guide, marking the height he wanted. Then he stepped back, inhaled deeply, and began the cut. The rhythmic rasp of metal-biting wood filled the quiet air, each pull wearing a deeper groove into the dense trunk. Chips scattered around his boots, pale and fragrant, releasing the tree's sharp, resinous scent. Mark worked with steady, controlled strength, letting the saw's teeth do the majority of the job. He angled the cut carefully, forming a wedge so the tree would fall exactly where he wanted, down the slope, away from his chosen foundation. After several long minutes, the trunk groaned softly. Mark paused to reposition himself, checked the wind again, and resumed cutting from the opposite side. The final crack echoed through the forest like a snapped bone. The tree leaned, hesitated, and then toppled with a deep whoosh of dislodged air before striking the moss with a muffled thud. The ground trembled under the impact, sending a faint vibration through Mark's knees. He exhaled, wiped sweat from his brow, and stepped forward to inspect the fallen tree. The trunk was straight, the grain was tight, and the bark peeled easily. Perfect. He wasted no time stripping the branches. The knife worked faster here, slicing through soft joints, sending small limbs tumbling aside in quick succession. He collected the thicker branches into a neat pile. He would use those later for internal framing or perhaps as reinforcement for the loft he was already envisioning. Once the trunk was clean, he measured it against the space he had chosen. It was slightly longer than necessary, but that was not a problem. Extra length could be trimmed, and sometimes unexpected pieces became useful in surprising ways. Satisfied, Mark turned his attention to the next few trees. He approached the second trunk with the same deliberate evaluation, noting its lean and the spacing between knots. This one would serve well as a header beam. He marked the cut line with cord and began the sawing rhythm again. The work was physically draining, but he welcomed the burn in his muscles. Sweat beaded at his temples despite the cool air beneath the tree canopy. His breathing grew deeper, but his pace remained constant. A second tree fell, then a third. By the time he finished felling the fourth, his arms vibrated from the repeated strain, and his shirt clung to his back. He straightened, rolling his shoulders as he took in the sight of the logs arranged along the slope. Sunlight shifted between the trunks above, creating long, trembling shadows across the clearing where he intended to build. He assessed the logs again, this time imagining how they would stack. Interlocking corners would require careful notching, simple enough with patience and a sharp blade, but time-consuming. He knew he could do it, though. He had done it before under less forgiving conditions. Before starting the notches, he needed a clean work surface. He moved to the center of the rise and began clearing the moss. Using the collapsible shovel-axe hybrid, he scraped away the soft layer until compact soil showed beneath. He leveled the ground methodically, turning the tool sideways when necessary to shave down small ridges. His movements were quiet and precise. Every few minutes he stepped back to look at the overall shape. He wanted the base of the cabin to be solid, square, and aligned properly. A poor foundation meant structural instability later, and he had no intention of building something half-finished. Once he had a flat work area, he rolled the first log into position. It was heavier than expected, forcing him to brace his feet and use both arms to lever it upward. The moss softened the friction slightly, but the ground was still uneven enough to resist him. He pushed, adjusted, pushed again, and finally maneuvered the log onto the cleared earth. He took a moment to catch his breath before kneeling beside it. With the knife's tip, he etched a shallow guideline across the end where he planned to cut the first notch. Then he set the knife aside, extended the multi-tool saw again, and began carving out the notch one careful stroke at a time. The process was slow. Sawdust gathered in small piles near his knees. Birds, or whatever passed for birds on this world, called intermittently above him. Once or twice he heard distant voices from other cadets, but they were far enough that he could barely distinguish individual words. Sweat trickled down his cheek. His hands grew sticky from resin. But the first notch began to take shape, a small concave indentation, deep and angled precisely enough to hold the crossing log securely. Mark tested the fit by dragging a second log over and pressing it into place. It locked beautifully. He allowed himself a brief smile before returning to work. Notching the second log took slightly less time, his hands already adjusted to the rhythm. The third and fourth went faster still. Eventually, he had 4 logs trimmed and shaped on each end, forming the beginnings of a rectangular frame. He dragged them into place one by one, fitting the corners together until the structure sat neatly on the flattened soil. He stepped back and examined the perimeter. The joints were tight, the frame level. It was only the beginning, but it already felt solid, real in a way that a simple lean-to never did. Mark wiped his knife clean against his pant leg and replaced it in the kit before taking a long breath of the resin-scented air. The suns hung lower now. The amber one dipped closer to the horizon, leaving only the pale one to cast longer, cooler shafts of light through the trees. He still had hours before dark, but he needed to maintain his pace. He moved back to the pile of branches he had stripped earlier and began sorting through them. Straight pieces went into one stack, curved ones into another. He wanted beams for the loft, cross pieces for the roof, a ridgepole thick enough to support the weight of whatever covering he decided to make. He selected a few suitable pieces and laid them next to his growing frame. Before installing anything, however, he needed to raise the walls higher. That meant more logs. He examined the remaining trunks he had felled and chose the straightest ones for the next layer. He measured them, trimmed their ends, and began carving notches into each. By now, his arms ached deeply, but the pain was familiar and oddly comforting. It reminded him of training sessions at home, of long hours spent maintaining equipment, repairing structures, or practicing fieldcraft drills. This was work he understood. Once the notches were ready, he stacked the second layer of logs onto the first. He had to brace each one with his shoulder while guiding it into place, but after a few adjustments and one moment where the log nearly rolled off and crushed his foot, he secured the second layer firmly. The structure rose to knee-height now. It was beginning to look like the foundation of a real cabin. He stepped back again, breathing harder but feeling a growing satisfaction in the work. The cabin was no longer just an idea in his mind. It was rising around him, piece by piece, shaped by his hands and decisions. The instructor had told him to build a simple shelter. But as Mark surveyed the logs and the expanding skeletal frame, he knew he was building something far more significant. He had no intention of stopping at bare necessity. He wanted stability, warmth, and utility. He wanted to leave behind a structure that could remain standing long after this training exercise ended. He picked up the multi-tool again, moved toward the next log in the line, and set the blade against the wood. The rasping sound of the saw filled the forest once more as Mark prepared the next piece, already envisioning how the walls would rise, how the roof would form, and how the cabin would stand completed on this quiet rise beneath the twin suns. Mark paused only long enough to stretch his aching fingers before moving to the next phase of construction. The base frame rose solidly around him, the notched logs interlocking with satisfying precision, but a cabin was far more than a low ring of timber. He needed walls that reached his shoulders at least, a roof capable of shedding rain, and a structure rigid enough to withstand the unpredictable winds that sometimes swept through this valley. The forest around him buzzed with soft insect voices and distant bird-like calls, but his focus stayed locked on the work. Each tool stroke, each measured movement brought him closer to the shape he carried in his mind, a shape far beyond what the instructor had intended when she said the word simple. He selected the next set of logs, running his hand along their smooth bark. These would form the mid-level courses of the wall. The weight of each trunk demanded careful leverage. He hooked his arms under the first one, braced his stance, and rolled it toward the rising structure. The sun's shifting position cast thin beams through the trees, glinting off the grain where he had scraped the trunk clean earlier. He rotated the log so that its best face faced outward, then knelt to carve the next set of notches. The saw dug into the wood with a familiar rasp, resin scent drifting up as he worked. His motions grew more precise with each repetition. The first notch took a while, the second went faster. By the time he finished shaping the ends, the sun had shifted again, creating a cooling draft through the trees. He heaved the log up onto the growing wall. The weight pressed into his shoulder until his muscles trembled. He angled it, adjusted the lower end, and then guided the upper notch into position. The log settled into place with a deep, satisfying thud. He stepped back, rubbing his shoulder, breathing hard, but feeling a quiet satisfaction settle through him. The cabin rose one layer higher, the corners locking tightly enough that he could press against the wall without the structure shifting at all. He repeated the cycle: select, measure, notch, raise. His arms burned with fatigue, each cut sending trembling feedback into his forearms. Sweat rolled down his back despite the cool air under the canopy. As he worked, he kept imagining the finished shape of the shelter: sturdy walls, angled roof, and the storage loft he wanted to use for gear. The loft would need beams, which meant he had to choose the right moment to install them, weaving them into the rising walls without compromising stability. But for now, he focused on height. Once the walls were tall enough, he could begin fitting the internal supports. Log by log, the walls climbed. When the fourth full layer locked into place, Mark took a step back and judged the proportions. The structure now reached his waist. It wasn't enough yet, not for a true cabin, but he could already envision how the space would feel once enclosed. He walked inside the rectangle and imagined where he would sit, where the loft ladder would go, where the fireplace would stand. The interior space felt surprisingly roomy. With the rise beneath it and the surrounding tree trunks standing like watchful pillars, the cabin felt sheltered from the valley winds even before the roof existed. Mark moved to the next set of logs. These were longer and slightly thicker. He had saved them deliberately for the upper section because they carried a more even weight distribution. He didn't want thin or warped logs near the top where the roof would attach. He knelt beside the first one and traced a shallow line with the tip of his knife to mark the notch position. His hands steadied, guided by habit more than conscious thought. As he sawed through the wood, he became aware of how quiet the forest around him had become. The bird-like calls had softened, and the distant cadet chatter seemed farther away now. He wondered briefly how the others were faring, whether anyone had finished a lean-to yet or given up and switched strategies. He doubted anyone had attempted something on this scale. The idea made him pause and smile faintly. The instructor would likely be baffled when she saw the result, perhaps even irritated, but he knew that no one could claim he misunderstood the assignment. A shelter was a shelter. He was simply ensuring his would endure. When the fifth layer was ready, he lifted it with a grunt, adjusting his stance as the heavy log shifted slightly. He planted his feet, pressed the lower end into the notch of the wall beneath, then leaned his shoulder into the upper end, forcing it up into place. The log slid suddenly and locked with a deep click. He stepped back, breath coming fast. The walls now reached nearly to his chest. He could stand inside and feel the enclosure forming around him. The air inside the structure felt stiller, warmer, sheltered by the rising wood. The next phase required more precision. Mark selected the thick, curved branches he had set aside earlier. He ran his fingers along their bends, checking for hairline splits. He chose the most even ones and carried them inside the structure. These would form the beams for the loft. He pressed the first one across the width of the cabin, testing how much it bowed under its own weight. The branch flexed but held firm. He used the multi-tool to strip away the remaining bark, exposing the smooth inner wood. Then he carved small grooves at both ends so the beam would rest securely between two courses of logs. He guided the beam up slowly, bracing one end against his shoulder as he maneuvered the opposite end into its notch. The branch settled into place with a muted thump, forming the central spine of the loft. He ran his hand across it, testing its stability. It would support gear easily, and maybe even his weight if necessary. He fetched two more beams, repeating the process, aligning them parallel across the width. When he finished, 3 beams stretched across the cabin, evenly spaced, forming the skeleton of the loft floor. Next came the supports. He selected small, straight branches from the sorted pile, split them into thinner slats using the knife, and began laying them across the beams. Each slat required trimming and adjusting, shaping the loft into a functional platform. The sound of splitting wood echoed softly inside the rising structure, rhythmic and purposeful. When all the slats were laid across the beams, the loft formed a stable surface that took up only a portion of the cabin's interior, leaving enough space beneath for a bench or extra storage. Mark stepped below it and checked the headroom. It felt perfect, high enough to move comfortably, low enough that heat from a future fire would warm the loft efficiently. The thought of the fire reminded him that he still needed a place for the fireplace. He surveyed the inner corner, choosing the spot where air currents would help guide smoke upward. He traced the shape of the future hearth on the soil with the tip of his boot, imagining the stone he would bring up from the creek later. But before he could lay a fireplace or even begin the roof, he needed the walls at their final height. He returned to the remaining logs. Only 2 long ones remained uncut. He dragged the first into position, the weight forcing him to lean his full strength into the movement. He knelt and began carving the notches. His arms trembled slightly now from exhaustion, but his hands stayed steady. Each stroke felt heavier than before, but he kept his pace steady, refusing to let fatigue slow him more than necessary. When the final notches were carved, he lifted the log toward the wall. This time, he could not rely solely on his strength. He wedged a branch under one end, using it as a lever to raise the log gradually. Then he slid his shoulder beneath the center, lifted, and edged the log up until he could settle the bottom notch into place. The top corner resisted him for a moment, but he leaned harder, pushed with everything he had left, and finally the log locked into the notch above. The cabin now stood tall enough that the walls reached Mark's shoulders. The structure felt enclosed, sturdy, ready for the next major task. He stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow with a shaking hand. The suns had shifted again, the angle of light casting the cabin in warm gold. The forest floor around him bore the marks of hard labor: sawdust piles, stripped branches, scattered wood chips. But the structure itself stood clean and well-shaped, rising from the mossy soil like it had always belonged there. Mark walked a slow, careful circle around the cabin, inspecting each corner, each join, each notch. Everything fit tightly, the logs compressed by their own weight and the precise angles he had carved. He felt a swell of quiet pride in his chest. The cabin walls were complete. The loft beams were in place. The next step would be the roof, tricky, time-consuming, requiring careful planning. But he was ready. The instructor had asked for a simple shelter, but Mark's cabin now stood as a testament not to minimalism, but to the human instinct to build something secure, functional, and lasting. He placed his hand on one of the upper logs and felt the solid resistance beneath his palm. The cabin was more than half finished, and he could already picture how it would look once the roof and fireplace were complete. He exhaled slowly, letting the moment settle. Then he turned back toward the pile of tools and branches, ready to begin the next stage. Mark stood beneath the half-finished walls and breathed in the resin-heavy air as he prepared himself mentally for the next phase. The roof would demand precision, strength, and balance. If the walls had been an exercise in endurance, the roof would test every bit of structural knowledge he carried. From the long hours he had spent learning how to brace beams correctly to the instinctive understanding of angles and weight he had developed long before arriving at this academy. He rubbed his palms against his pants to remove lingering wood dust and stepped toward the pile of branches and stripped beams he had arranged earlier. The sun had shifted again, and the amber one dipped low enough that long shadows stretched between the trees. The temperature dropped slightly. That was his silent reminder of why the cabin needed a fully functional roof before dusk. He could not leave the structure exposed. The first step was installing the ridgepole, the central spine of the roof. He examined the logs he had set aside for this purpose. One in particular stood out, straight, evenly thick, and stripped clean of branches. He rolled it across the ground, listening to the subtle thuds as it bounced over roots. The sound told him it was dense enough to hold weight, but not so heavy that he would be crushed under it. He dragged the ridgepole to the cabin's front and positioned it carefully. Raising it alone would take planning. He knelt and checked the height of the upper logs, imagining where the ridgepole would sit. He needed support beams on both ends, slanted just enough to allow rain to slide off the roof rather than pool on top of it. He walked around the structure and chose 2 sturdy Y-shaped branches with natural forks. Those would cradle the ridgepole at the correct height. He stripped their bark clean, trimmed the ends flat, and carried them inside the cabin. With the shovel-axe tool, he dug 2 shallow holes at opposite ends, carefully measuring their positions so the beams would align perfectly. He tamped the soil firmly around the base of each forked branch, pushing them into place until they stood upright without wobbling. He stepped back, inspecting their height. Good. They would hold. Now came the hardest part. Mark squatted, lifted one end of the ridgepole, and dragged it through the doorway frame. Maneuvering the long log inside the structure was awkward. He had to twist his body, adjust the angle, and brace the pole against his shoulder to prevent it from slipping. Sweat stung his eyes as he positioned one end into the fork. When the log rested securely, he moved to the other side, planted both feet, and heaved upward. The ridgepole slid into the second fork with a sharp, clean tap. Mark steadied it with both hands, testing its balance. It held firm. Relief loosened his tense muscles for a moment. With the ridgepole in place, the shape of the future roof finally materialized, a skeletal outline of a shelter that could withstand whatever weather this valley decided to unleash. Next, he gathered the angled support beams, choosing branches slightly thinner than the ridgepole, but strong enough to bear the weight of the roof covering. He trimmed each one so it would fit between the ridgepole and the upper wall logs, forming a steep, protective angle. He placed the first beam on the eastern side, sliding its lower end into a small notch he carved on the wall log, then lifting its upper end until it met the ridgepole at the perfect angle. He secured it with a piece of synthetic cord, wrapping the beam tightly until it pressed snugly into place. He tugged hard to confirm the bond. The cord held fast. Beam after beam, Mark worked his way along the length of the cabin, installing angled supports at regular intervals. His shoulders throbbed as he lifted each one, and his arms trembled with the repeated strain. Yet the rhythm of the work steadied him. Lift, position, secure. Lift, position, secure. The forest hummed around him, its sounds grounding him in the quiet certainty of the moment. A steady structure grew above him, transforming the cabin from a hollow frame into a shelter with bones strong enough to hold against storms. With the angled beams in place, he began preparing the roof slats. He examined the remaining pile of stripped branches, selecting the straightest ones for the task. Each branch needed to lie flat across the angled beams to provide a surface for insulation. He sat on the mossy ground, using the knife to cut each branch to length, trimming off knots and smoothing rough edges. The repetitive motion eased the strain in his shoulders, allowing his mind to drift. He wondered briefly what the other cadets were building, if anyone had realized how much the temperature could drop after sunset here, or how quickly the valley winds could tear apart flimsy structures. He doubted anyone else was building a roof with this level of care. When the slats were ready, he climbed onto a temporary platform he had formed by stacking leftover logs. The height allowed him to reach the angled beams more easily. He laid the first slat across the supports, aligning it neatly so it formed a clean edge. Then he took 2 pieces of wire, twisted them tightly around the slat, and secured it firmly to the beams beneath. The metal bit into the wood with a faint crunch. He tested the slat with his weight. It held. He placed the next slat slightly overlapping the first, allowing runoff to slide over it rather than drip through the cracks. Soon, an entire line of slats stretched across the eastern side of the roof. The pattern grew quickly once he fell into the rhythm. With each piece, the roof thickened. The angled beams took on the look of ribs, and the slats became the vertebrae of the structure. From inside the cabin, the shadows cast by the forming roof shifted, taking on a more enclosed, sheltering appearance. Once the slats covered the eastern side, he repeated the process on the western side. This half required more caution because the slope faced the prevailing winds. He added a few extra slats for reinforcement, tightening each wire with extra twists. When the final slat was installed, the roof formed a solid, angled surface, but it lacked insulation. Rain would slip off it easily, but the gaps between slats would not stop drafts or heat loss. Mark exhaled, rubbing his aching forearms. The hardest part of the roof was still ahead, creating the covering. He needed something dense, dry, and flexible. Moss and stripped bark were the obvious choices. He scanned the nearby trees and noticed large sheets of flaky bark clinging to several trunks. Perfect. He approached the nearest tree and slid the knife beneath a loose section. The bark separated with a dry crackle. He pulled away a wide sheet, flexible enough to bend but thick enough to block wind. He collected several sheets from different trees, making sure not to strip too much from any single trunk. He respected the environment and knew the instructor would evaluate him on that. He carried the bark sheets back to the cabin and climbed onto the platform again. One by one, he laid them across the slats, aligning each sheet so it overlapped the one below it, forming a natural shingle pattern. With each addition, the roof transformed into something that looked less like a construction project and more like a true survival shelter. He used cord and wire sparingly, tying the edges where necessary to prevent wind from lifting them. He pressed each sheet firmly against the slats, feeling the satisfying resistance beneath his palms. Thin cracks still peeked between a few sheets, so he filled them with thick moss, pressing it in until no gaps remained. After finishing one side, he repeated the work on the other, layering and securing each bark sheet with practiced motions. When the final sheet was in place, he climbed down slowly, muscles trembling from the hours of work, and stepped back to study the roof. It sloped beautifully, shedding light in a soft curve. The bark shingles blended with the forest, giving the cabin a natural look that made it seem as though it belonged here. The roof felt sturdy, well anchored, and capable of enduring rain, wind, and perhaps even the valley's occasional hailstorms. But Mark wasn't finished yet. He moved inside, examining the light filtering through the roof. Only thin, muted bands made it through now. The interior felt dimmer, warmer, more contained. He placed his hands on the loft beams, testing their stability, then stepped beneath the ridgepole. The roof held firm above him without creaking. He nodded to himself, satisfied. Now he turned to the idea that had been forming in his mind since he traced the shape of the fireplace earlier. The roof needed ventilation to keep smoke from filling the cabin. He approached the ridgepole and examined the area near the top. The bark sheets overlapped too tightly for smoke to pass through, so he created a small, carefully positioned gap near the highest point of the roof. He adjusted the bark around it, leaving an angled vent that would draw smoke upward and out without letting rain in. The design wasn't elegant, but it was functional, and that was all he needed. With that final adjustment made, Mark stepped outside again and circled the cabin. The angled roofline cast a long shadow over the ground. The bark shingles glowed faintly in the remaining sunlight. The cabin stood solid, complete on the outside except for the entryway. The loft, the walls, the roof, all came together in a structure that defied the simplicity of the assignment. He knelt near the doorway and began clearing the earth in front of it. His next task would be the fireplace, and that required stone. The creek lay just beyond the rise, and he knew exactly which stones he would gather. But as he stood, wiping dirt from his hands and feeling the faint tremble in his exhausted arms, he allowed himself a moment of stillness. The cabin was taking shape faster than he had expected. The roof stood strong above him, the loft waited inside, and soon the fireplace would complete the structure. When the instructor arrived, she would see nothing simple, only the unmistakable mark of a human who had taken the assignment and elevated it far beyond expectations. Mark took a slow breath, stared up at the roof one last time, and then walked toward the creek with purposeful steps, ready to begin collecting stones for the heart of the cabin. Mark followed the faint sound of water down the slope, feeling the ache in his shoulders deepen with every step, but he refused to slow. The cabin behind him already offered shelter in a way that felt almost comforting, even unfinished, yet he knew that without a proper fire source, it would be nothing more than a cool, dark box when night truly settled over the valley. The creek ran in a narrow channel between worn stones, the water clear enough that he could see pale pebbles shifting lazily along the bottom. He crouched at the edge and let his fingers sink into the water for a moment. The cold bite sent a sharp jolt up his arm and cleared his tired mind. He scanned the banks for stones that could endure repeated heating and cooling without cracking. Flat river stones, dense and smooth, caught his attention immediately. He began collecting them, testing each one with a firm grip, checking for fractures. Those that felt weak he tossed aside. The stronger ones he stacked in a growing pile near his boots. When he had enough to form at least a ring and a crude chimney base, he began carrying them back up the rise in small loads, refusing to risk dropping a full armful and losing precious time. The repeated trips up and down the slope gnawed at his endurance, but each pile beside the cabin doorway made the effort feel worthwhile. Inside the cabin, the air already felt different from the open forest. The new roof muted the sounds outside, trapping a quiet stillness within the log walls. Mark knelt in the corner he had marked earlier and began clearing the ground more thoroughly, scraping away moss and loosening compacted soil until he reached firm earth. He leveled the surface carefully, then started arranging the stones in a tight ring, leaving one side slightly more open to act as the fire's mouth. With the precision of someone who had built makeshift hearths in less forgiving places, he staggered the stones, stacking them so each layer overlapped the gaps beneath. The ring grew into a low wall. He left a narrow channel at the back that would guide smoke upward and toward the vent he had carved near the ridgepole. When the basic firebox stood steadily on its own, he added a second ring of stones on the side where the chimney would form, building it taller, leaving an inner passage for smoke. It would not be as efficient as a full carved flue, but it would draw air upward and out rather than letting the cabin fill with fumes. Satisfied with the rough shape, he stepped outside again and gathered smaller rocks to wedge into the cracks, filling gaps and stabilizing the structure. Back inside, he packed damp soil around the base of the stones to seal them. His hands grew gritty and cold, but he worked steadily until nothing shifted under his touch. The fireplace took on a squat, sturdy presence in the corner, the pale stones contrasting with the dark logs around them. He could already imagine the glow of embers painting the cabin's interior in soft orange light. Mark collected dry twigs, shredded bark strips, and pockets of brittle needlefall from near the trees. He arranged the kindling carefully inside the fire ring. Then he took a thin split of bark and shaved it into curls with his knife, forming a small nest of tinder. From his standard field kit, he drew the permitted ignition tool, a compact striker block that the Academy issued for exercises exactly like this. He scraped steel against stone until sparks showered down onto the tinder. The first few fizzled uselessly, but the fourth spark caught. The shredded bark glowed, then flared into a tiny, determined flame. He bent close, cupping his hands to shield the flicker from stray drafts, and fed it the smallest twigs until the fire grew strong enough to lick at the larger kindling. Within minutes, a small but steady fire crackled in the stone ring, sending radiant heat into the cabin's interior. Smoke curled upward, seeking the highest point, and slipped cleanly toward the vent at the roof. A faint trail escaped outside, carrying the sharp scent of resin and bark. Mark watched the draw critically, ready to adjust the vent if the smoke hesitated, but the chimney effect worked better than he had hoped. The air inside remained breathable, the fire burned bright, and warmth began to seep into the logs and packed moss of the walls. He stood, rubbing his sore hands together, and glanced up at the loft. That space would capture rising heat perfectly. He climbed the interior support branches he had fashioned into a crude ladder and eased himself onto the loft platform. The floor flexed slightly under his weight but held firm. He lay on his stomach, reached down, and felt the warmth rising toward him. A tired smile tugged at his mouth. Sleeping up here would be far more comfortable than on the cold ground. He descended carefully and spent the remaining time refining small details. He fashioned a simple door panel from a woven lattice of branches, reinforced with bark and moss, leaving enough gaps at the top and sides that fresh air could still flow. He installed it with cord loops that let the panel swing inward. He dragged a thick, flat log to the wall opposite the fireplace and shaped it into a crude bench. He smoothed its surface as best he could with the knife, then tested it with his weight. It held. He stacked a few remaining dry branches near the fireplace, forming a neat cache of fuel. By the time he stepped back to take in the full interior, the cabin had transformed from construction site into something that felt lived in, even if only for an afternoon. Outside, the light had shifted into late-cycle hues. The amber sun hovered near the ridgeline, casting longer shadows that pooled between the trees. A distant horn call echoed through the valley, the Academy's signal that the construction phase was reaching its end. Mark extinguished the fire partially, letting the flames die down until only glowing embers remained, then stepped out through the doorway to scan the clearing below. From his vantage point on the rise, he could see scattered shapes of shelters the other cadets had built. Low lean-tos, thermal cocoons, a few quick-assembled fabric domes anchored with stones. Instructors in gray moved among them, making notes, recording comments. The main instructor, the tall woman with the 4 narrow eyes, strode at the center of the group, her gaze sweeping the valley. After a moment, Her attention shifted toward the forest. Mark did not need enhanced vision to know she had noticed the thin ribbon of smoke rising from his cabin's vent. Soon, the evaluation group moved toward the tree line. Mark remained near the cabin's doorway, standing straight but relaxed, his expression neutral. He did not feel nervous in the way he had at the start of the exercise. He felt something quieter, more grounded. Whatever came next, the cabin was real, functional, and his. The instructor stepped into the trees first, her boots making only soft sounds on the needle-strewn ground. 2 assistant instructors followed her, along with a cluster of cadets who craned their necks, curious. As the group crested the small rise and the cabin came fully into view, the conversations behind her died mid-sentence. The log structure stood solidly against the backdrop of trees, roof sloping neatly, bark shingles blending with surrounding trunks. The faint thread of smoke from the vent curled into the air like a punctuation mark. The instructor stopped dead. Her upper pair of eyes widened while the lower pair narrowed in a way Mark had learned meant intense focus. For a long moment she said nothing. The cadets fanned out behind her, some gasping softly, some muttering in disbelief. A few turned their heads from the cabin to Mark and back again, as if expecting the scene to shift into something more ordinary. The instructor finally exhaled a slow breath and approached the structure, one hand trailing along the outer wall. Her fingers traced the notched joints, the packed moss between logs, the angle of the roof beams. She walked a full circle around the cabin, inspecting everything without a word. The assistant instructors followed at a respectful distance, each wearing an expression that hovered between amusement and astonishment. When she returned to the front, she fixed all 4 eyes on Mark. "Cadet Rains," she said, her voice lower than usual, as if she had not yet decided how to shape the words that followed. "You were told to construct a shelter." He held her gaze. "Yes, instructor." "You were instructed," she continued, "to keep it simple, to demonstrate minimal environmental impact, efficient use of resources, and basic protective qualities." Her tone did not sharpen on the word simple, but the emphasis was clear. Mark glanced briefly at the cabin, then back to her. "It protects from wind and rain," he said calmly. "Impacts are localized and measured. Materials are all within the valley's regrowth capacity. I logged each decision if you wish to review it." A faint twitch at the corner of her mouth suggested she recognized the deliberate precision in his answer. She turned slightly and gestured toward the doorway. "Show me." Mark stepped aside and held the woven door panel open. Warmth rolled out in a slow wave, carrying the scents of smoke, resin, and freshly disturbed earth. The instructor ducked in first, followed by 1 assistant instructor. The interior felt smaller with more bodies inside, but not cramped. She stood in the center, turned slowly, and took in the fireplace, the bench, the loft beams above. Her gaze lingered on the stone hearth, where the last embers still glowed faintly. She knelt beside the fireplace, examined the stone layering, the soot trail leading toward the vent, the lack of smoke haze above. She ran her hand along a loft beam, then pressed one palm flat against the inner wall where moss insulation sat packed between the logs. She did not speak for several long moments. When she finally rose to her full height again, she faced Mark. "This is not a simple shelter," she said quietly. "This is a cabin." Mark hesitated, then allowed a small, tired smile. "Where I come from, this is still simple," he said. "No metal fasteners except what was issued, no machined parts, no prefabricated panels, just wood, stone, and the tools you gave me." The assistant instructor snorted softly under his breath, though he quickly turned it into a cough when she shot him a sharp look. The instructor studied Mark for another long moment, and he could almost see the calculations running behind her eyes. Resource usage, time spent, physical exertion, structural integrity, comparison to other cadets' efforts. He could also see the part of her that was undeniably impressed, no matter how much she tried to maintain a neutral tone. She stepped back out into the fading light, gesturing for him to follow. The waiting cadets fell silent again as she turned to address the group. "For this exercise," she began, "the evaluation parameters remain unchanged. Simplicity, efficiency, and minimal impact are the core metrics. Some of you have met them. Some of you have not." Her gaze swept briefly over a sagging lean-to near the tree line and a half-collapsed thermal cocoon. A few cadets shifted uncomfortably. Then she turned back toward the cabin. "Cadet Rains has constructed something that exceeds the stated scope by a significant margin. This structure is, in fact, disqualified from ranking directly alongside the others." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Mark felt a small, stubborn sting in his chest, although he had anticipated such a response. Disqualified sounded harsher than he had hoped. The instructor raised one hand and the murmurs died. "However," she continued, "to ignore the effectiveness and craftsmanship on display would be a failure of instruction on my part." Her tone changed, gaining weight. "This cabin demonstrates advanced application of structural principles, heat management, and resource use. It offers sustained shelter, not just for one night, but for many cycles. It will be retained here as a permanent demonstration model." The sting in Mark's chest faded, replaced by a slow, spreading sense of quiet pride. Some of the cadets turned to stare at him with open curiosity now, as if seeing him for the first time as something other than an anomaly borrowed from a distant world. The instructor faced him fully once more. "Cadet Rains," she said, "you have failed to follow the precise spirit of the assignment, but you have also reminded this academy of why your species is given such latitude in field work. When confronted with simple, you built secure. When asked for enough, you built more than enough. This tendency is dangerous when misapplied and invaluable when directed correctly. You will attend an additional debriefing after this exercise to document your process in detail." Her lower eyes narrowed slightly, but the expression no longer felt entirely stern. "And you will teach a supplemental workshop on practical shelter construction next cycle, so that the others may benefit from your excess." A few cadets laughed softly at that choice of word, but Mark heard the respect beneath the humor. He inclined his head. "Understood, instructor." She nodded once in acknowledgement, then turned back to the group. "For the remainder of this training period, this structure will remain available as a fallback shelter," she announced. "In the event of sudden weather shifts or extended exercises, you may study it, use it, and learn from it. Record your observations. Consider what you would have done differently and what you would keep the same." As the evaluation moved on and cadets drifted away in clusters, still talking about the cabin, Mark remained on the rise for a few moments longer, looking at what he had built. The log walls glowed faintly under the last light from the amber sun. Smoke no longer rose from the vent, but the scent of burnt resin lingered reassuringly in the air. He imagined future trainees stepping inside, running curious hands along the beams he had shaped, lighting new fires in the hearth he had stacked, climbing into the loft he had tested with his own weight. The idea felt strange and satisfying at the same time. This cabin would remain here long after this trial, a quiet testament not to some grand achievement, but to the simple human refusal to do only the minimum when survival and comfort could be secured more fully. As the instructor called for the cadets to assemble for final briefing, Mark took one last slow breath of forest air and turned toward the clearing. His muscles still ached and his hands were raw, yet his stride felt lighter. He had not won the exercise in the traditional sense, but he had left something behind that would outlast the scoring sheet and the day's schedule. On a distant world, under twin suns and alien trees, a cabin with a fireplace and a storage loft now stood where there had been nothing but moss and roots that morning. That, he decided, was reason enough to be content with how he had interpreted the word shelter.